Okay, so let me show you how final works in Java. So let's start by creating a class called employee, and we need two variables, one int called ID, and let's set it to a random int 1010. And we also need a string. Let's call it employer, and let's set it to Apple. Now we also need a constructor. And I will show you how final works just in a moment. Now we also need a method that can change these two variables that we have written here. Let's call this method setValues. So ID will be changed to a random ID, and the same goes for the employer. Now let's use final. So let's say that you have a variable that you don't want to modify or change its value after you have initialized it the first time. Then you can make it final. So let's say we want to make ID, the ID variable, final. Then we just type final before the data type here. And so what final will do, again, it will just make this variable behave more like a constant that cannot be changed after we have set it. And that's why we get two errors here, one in the constructor and one in our method. And that's because it's final now and it cannot be modified anymore. And the error says cannot assign a value to final variable ID. Now we can let the constructor assign a value to the variable, and after that it cannot be changed. So I can just make the ID variable blank, a blank final variable, and in this method we can remove this line since we have made it final. Now this variable will only be final for one instance of this class. So every employee object will have its own ID that is final and cannot be changed after we have set a value to it. But let's say that you want a variable that is final, meaning it cannot be modified, but also is shared by all instances of one class. Then we can make it static and final. So for example, if I want every instance of the employee class to have the same employer, like Apple, so I will just write static and final here, and the order doesn't really matter. You can also type final static. Now it's also common to make final static variables public, so it can be easier accessed outside the class by calling the class name. And it will pretty much make it a constant. And of course we get errors because we have made it static and final. We can just remove this from the constructor and also the method. And it's also good to make static final variables uppercase to really show that it is a constant variable and to follow the naming convention. And that's how final works for variables, like primitives or strings. But it's a bit different for objects, lists, and static arrays. For example, if I make an array list here and call it work duties, and if I try to add an element to this list, then you can see that it doesn't result in any errors. And if I make this list final, still we don't get any errors. So I can still add, remove, or use the collection methods, even though I have made it final. But we can't do this. So I can't reinitialize this list or assigned from another list to this one. Now you can also make a class final. Let's remove this and this list. So if I show you a small example by writing a new class called manager and try to extend to the employee class, then you can see we can extend it just fine. But if we make the employee class final, then we get an error. And the error says that we cannot inherit a final class. So what final does here to a class is that it prohibits the class from being inherited. And that's pretty much it. Now you can also make methods final. So if I just remove final from the employee class, so if I just make a new method here and call it print something, so it will just print out hello. Now if I try to override this method, you can see it's possible and we do not get any errors. But if we make the method in the employee class final, then we get an error that says that we cannot override this method because it's final. So final just prevents methods from being overridden. And I think that's pretty much it for this video.